to dwell. Dimitri Lascaris, the man of the hour, the man himself. Dimitri is a lawyer, journalist, activist from Montreal, Quebec in 2020. He ran for the leadership of the Green Party in Canada. And again, a good friend of the show that I am deeply appreciative for coming on. How you doing, man? You doing okay?
Hey man, I'm doing as well as I can in this time of genocide, Jamarl. It's not easy for any of us who care about humanity, you know. But I
No,
can't complain. I'm relatively fortunate, so I really can't complain.
I feel you on that. Um, I think my mom would say my mood is darkened. My take on reality is darkened. Um, the things that I thought was allowed in reality or wasn't allowed in reality, apparently they are, which, you know, regardless of how you look at it, is real, right?
Yeah.
I agree with you. It's a dark
Never,
time, depending
never. I
on.
never thought I'd live to see what we're seeing today. I mean, I knew Western governments were capable of horrible things, but this was unexpected, shall we say,
The thing
in any
is,
event.
I grew up in America thinking Europe was more rational, more ethical. I mean, after all, they have a healthcare system, they have an education system. We don't have this stuff in America. On some level, there's an implicit thing of, okay, at the very least, we care about our own people. Um, not so much. Not so much. I look. I will be honest with you. I'm very shocked, and I've been shocked a few times. The war in Ukraine shocked me that we'd push a government into something like that. The genocide in Israel, that this would just be allowed and supported, that has shocked me to no end. Like, yeah, my view of the world has shifted.
Yeah, and
Um,
the
let me ask
crushing of
you.
what democracy. We're watching that too. Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt, but I had to
no,
just
no,
add
you're
that
fine.
into
Yeah, the
consideration.
Romania thing,
Mhm.
knocking over the, preventing Romania from having their governments, putting Le Pen in jail. All of that stuff is just outlandish. Not putting people in jail for free speech issues. I mean, it's just amazing. Let me ask you
Yeah.
this. Before I get to anything else, I have to go to Canada and the tariffs. How is Canada dealing with Donald Trump effectively no longer being a quote unquote partner with Canada in this?
There is a lot of hostility in Canada right now towards the US government.
You
I
don't
don't think
say.
yes, a lot. I've never seen this kind of hostility in my life. Yeah, and I'm sure you're not surprised. A lot of people wouldn't be surprised by that. Generally, Canadians have had quite positive impression of the US, the people of America, but, also the government. Most Canadians, I think, have had a generally favorable impression, and, that was true, uh, shockingly, even throughout the Biden-supported genocide, you know? I'm sure that, Biden's favorability rating took a hit in Canada, during, the last year of his presidency, but, even then, I think a majority of Canadians continued to have a relatively positive view of the US government, shockingly. Um,
Yeah.
Now, though, I think very, very few people, I mean, maybe 10%, 15%, and, people are very worried, because, Canada's, largest trading partner by far is the United States. The trade with the United States, I think I can't remember the exact number, it was something like 50 or 60% of Canadian GDP. That's how big it is,
Mhm.
whereas US trade with Canada is something like 15% of its GDP. So, huge reduction in trade between Canada and the US is going to have a much bigger impact on Canada than it will on
Right.
the United States. And then there's all this, people being deported and this talk about Canada being, made the 51st state. There was a poll done recently which showed that 88% of Canadians, after this, Trump said Canada's gonna be the 51st state, 88% of Canadians, uh, said no. Well, they want nothing to do with this idea. They want Canada to remain an independent state. And even in the most pro-American province, in Canada, which is Alberta, it's the most conservative right-leaning province. The number that were hotly opposed to Canada joining with the United States was in excess of 80%. So, not a lot of love for the US government right now.
I don't blame him, considering he's effectively dealing with their economy. What is that? It's the economy, stupid. And if you're doing something to damage people's livelihoods, they're going to feel some kind of way about the fact that you're doing it, especially if it's random, and it's purely an issue of dominance. We can do it because we can. We have the power to do it, so we're doing it. And yes, but it's just wow. I was just curious on how Canada was effectively taking this on the ground. Has the government decided what they're going to do in response?
They really only have one proposal. I mean, it's a two-track response. The one is reciprocal tariffs, retaliate, and the second is, plead and beg with the Trump administration and various sympathetic figures in the Senate and Congress and governors to persuade Trump not to do it. That's it. That's all they got. And they have thrown out this. I've ridiculed this idea. I just can't believe the ignorance of Canadian political leaders. The two leading candidates, are of course Mark Carney, former Goldman Sachs banker, a former governor of the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, who now seems poised to win the election, even though the Liberals were about to take a terrible drubbing under Trudeau. And the other is a guy named Pierre Poilievre, who's I call him the yapping Zionist Chihuahua. And if you listen to him speak, you would understand. But in any event, they're talking about, more deeply integrating Canada's economy with the European Union. How do they not see that the European Union is a Titanic that it's in an iceberg and it's going down? How do they not see this? How do they not see? I mean, Carney, a banker, he can't see the official economic statistics. That's not a solution. A solution, if you want to rely on trade, I think the first priority should be to develop domestic industries so that we can supply ourselves with what we need for our own well-being and have control of our own destiny. There's no talk about that at all. Zero. Not even the supposed left-wing parties are talking about that. The Greens and the NDP. But if we're going to have trade, you'd presumably go to the people who have the biggest economies and are showing the highest levels of growth, which is BRICS, right? There's zero discussion of that. It's not even on the table. It's not something that's even worthy of being talked about. That's how impoverished the political discourse is in Canada.
Interesting. Wow. I mean, I guess Canada considers themselves like a North American, European, it's like the closest thing to Europe or North America in an odd way.
Yeah, Jamarl, the political elite of Canada is white supremacist. I mean, that's just the bottom line, right? These people can't get their heads around, becoming closer to the non-Western world, the global South, than they are with, the European states and the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. They just can't even imagine it because there's a lot of latent white supremacy there. I think we have to be honest about that in Canada.
Fair point. I accept that point. You get no pushback on that point. I agree with you. Look, I strongly suspect that even, I used to think that an interregnum was taking place between the US and China or the US and Russia. And I realized it's not individual states. It's more so the Western world led by the US at this point, because the US is the strongest of the Western world, where they've lumped themselves in together thinking we're holding back the night being everybody else. Like it's 14% of the globe that decides that they're going to dictate terms for everybody else. And even when they talk in a sense like as if their point of view supersedes the 75% of the rest of the world. It's very bizarre in the way that they do it. So I agree with you. There's no pushback on that. I agree with you. I want to get into this. So Donald Trump is with Netanyahu. Netanyahu came to the White House. I apologize for the congested. That cold. Netanyahu came to the White House. And Donald Trump was just sitting there, buddy, arm in arm with him. But while they were there, Donald Trump said this. And he said this about Iran. And in order to get the context, Iran has effectively said that they weren't going to negotiate. We're not negotiating. We will do so indirectly. Now, is there a difference? Well, they think it's a face-saving mechanism to say we're doing it indirectly. So fair enough. And they would also make the argument, well, we've always engaged with the US indirectly. So this is not really a change in the status quo of things. All right. Fast forward. So Donald Trump has threatened Iran And he doubles down while Netanyahu is sitting there with them in the White House.
We had great discussions today, I think, on the obvious subject of Iran. We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started. It'll go on Saturday. We have a very big meeting, and we'll see what can happen. And I think everybody agrees that doing a deal would be preferable to doing the obvious. And the obvious is not something that I want to be involved with, or frankly, that Israel wants to be involved with if they can avoid it. So we're going to see if we can avoid it. But it's getting to be very dangerous territory. And hopefully those talks will be successful. And I think it would be in Iran's best interest if they are successful. We hope that's going to happen. A big problem that we've done, I think I'll ask Pete to maybe talk about it for a second, because a lot of people are asking the Houthis. We've been very tough and very successful militarily.
I'll stop it there. Now, most of that is outrageous. And the context of this blows me away. And for people who are making this argument like, well, Iran should just capitulate because, the U.S. is the U.S., that seems outrageous to me. Donald, he's sitting there with a literal war criminal that has just murdered a 14-year-old American child, by the way, and is arm in arm. Israel, who's wanted to destroy Iran for like 30 years and has tried to get the U.S. to do it for like 30 years, implying that Iran has a bomb, something that the U.S. acknowledges they do not. And we acknowledge they're not trying to. And Donald Trump's argument is, well, I know we're sitting here with a war criminal that has murdered and slaughtered like 100,000 people and has invaded all of its neighbors and has a nuclear bomb, by the way. But Iran, a country that has invaded nobody, that doesn't have a nuclear weapon, they're going to get it if they don't negotiate with me. And if the negotiations don't go my way, they're going to get it anyway. That's outrageous. That's outrageous. Iran has come back and apparently is going to negotiate. And the reporting that has come out effectively says, if they go right here, I just showed a post. I don't want people to take my word for it. I want to get your take, even though it's a large windup. Right here. It seems that on Saturday in Oman, Aragachi and Vitakov, these are ministers within the Iranian government, will first begin indirect negotiations. After an hour or two, if the outcome is positive, they will proceed with direct talks. So Trump has come out and effectively said, look, Iran is going to have direct talks with us, which completely undercuts the Ayatollah's argument of no direct talks with Trump. Give me a take on this. I'm not Iranian. Yeah. Give me a take on this.
This is my first time I've heard that Iran's communicated that they're going to have direct talks. So I'm just going to have to assume that that's an accurate report, but I need to inform myself better to decide whether or not there's something else going on here. But let's suppose it's an accurate report. First of all, there was tension in the Iranian government between the Ayatollah, who I think is more hardline, than Pezeshkian, the recently elected president, who I think is more concerned about avoiding war. I don't think either of them wants a war with the United States, to be clear. But I think that Pezeshkian, he's probably, willing to make more concessions than the Ayatollah is. The second thing is, the Russians are strategic partners of Iran, and I think the Russians are probably telling them, I understand where you're coming from, but you should sit down and at least talk to them. What is the harm in having a face-to-face discussion? If you don't like the direction, you can pull out. And let's recall that, there were plenty of reports that the Russians were saying that to Bashar al-Assad in terms of his relationship with Erdogan in Turkey. And Bashar al-Assad said no repeatedly, and look what happened to Bashar al-Assad. So I suspect that the Russians are communicating a message along those lines. Not that they'll abandon Iran, but that, don't be so hard-headed that you miss an opportunity for a peaceful resolution. So I personally don't, frankly, attach a lot of weight to whether they're direct or indirect talks, Jamarl, and I don't think that really matters at the end of the day. What matters is, what does the United States want? What does it want? And, Scott Ritter, I heard you talk about Scott Ritter. We don't need to go, get into that. I've had my own concerns with Scott. I've had my own exchange with him on, on X about some of the things he's been saying. But he's saying, and I'm just using him as an example, there are others who are taking this line, that what they want is for Iran to end its nuclear program. Okay, so let's just stop for a moment and note that the 2025 threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence agencies says that Iran is not seeking a nuclear weapon.
Exactly.
It just came out, and not only did it say that, it said that the Ayatollah suspended the nuclear weapons program 22 years ago, and they've never resigned from that position. Okay, so secondly, they have a right under international law to have a peaceful nuclear program. Thirdly,
Exactly.
Israel has, a nuclear arsenal that's capable of destroying the entirety of West Asia, if not setting the entire world on fire. And they're the only state in West Asia that is not a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So no one's inspecting their nuclear weapons, and they're acting like absolute criminally insane lunatics who are entirely capable of using nukes. No one should doubt their capacity to do that. Okay, so we're supposed to be worried about the Iranians? Are you kidding me? So,
Exactly.
but I want to go back to Ritter's position. Ritter's position is, and others, okay, well, nonetheless, it's the reality. You could end up in a bad place if you don't negotiate on this point. So you should at least sit down and think seriously about serious restrictions, if not dispensing entirely with your lawful and peaceful civil nuclear program. And this is a point I made to Scott on X, it's not just about the nuclear program. And in fact, if you look at the threat assessment, there's good reason to doubt that has to do with the nuclear program. What they want just as much, if not more so, Jamarl, and this was something that Trump tried to get them to do several years ago, was to give up on their ballistic conventional missiles, which is the best defense they have, as you know. And secondly, they want them to stop supporting the axis of resistance. So effectively, they want Iran to render itself completely defensive on here. And I would be shocked. I would be shocked about two things. I would be shocked if Trump is not demanding this, with Netanyahu behind him saying, you've got to get this. Anything less than that, we go to war. And I would be shocked if the Iranians would agree to it. That's the real issue. Are they willing to capitulate to avoid a war? And at the end of the day, will they ultimately avoid one? I doubt that. You give the Trump administration and Netanyahu, a hand, they'll take an arm. You give them an arm, they'll take a torso. You give them a torso, they'll take the entire body. The one thing you don't want to do at this stage, after they entered into that nuclear deal, they respected the nuclear deal. It was effective to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon, and Trump, without any justification, pulled out of it. I think that they would be ill-advised to be making major concessions at this point. What I would be saying if I were in their situation is, look, we're willing to accept some more severe restrictions on our nuclear program than we accepted under people from suffering. But more than that, if you actually want us to give up the program, we have nothing to talk about. If you want us to give up our ballistic conventional missiles, we have nothing to talk about. And if you want us to stop supporting the axis of resistance, we have nothing to talk about. That's what I think is probably going to happen, but who knows?
This is about the destruction of Iran. Period. It's not about the negotiations. The negotiations is a stalking horse for the destruction of Iran. Look, people think it's not about treaties. It's not about morality. It's not about ethics. You have an objective in mind. That objective in mind was stated very clearly by Wesley Clark. We're going to destroy all these 7 Muslim nations, with Iran being at the very end. If Iran is insane enough to give up its ballistic treaties, that is effectively, or ballistic missiles, that is effectively giving up sovereignty. And I promise you, in the same way that they went after Syria, that they're bombing Libya, that they're bombing Lebanon, and these countries have no capacity to defend themselves, Iran will be next. It doesn't matter the treaty that they may sign in this. The U.S. blows off treaties left and right. They blew off the JCPOA. They blew off the Minsk agreements. They blew off the missile agreements that they had with Russia or the Soviet Union. They blew off even NAFTA. Even NAFTA, they blew off, right? So Even the ceasefire that Donald Trump negotiated, they allow Israel to violate on purpose in order to give them more weapons so they can continue their genocidal rampage. Do we honestly believe that Israel is an honest actor that would acknowledge any deal that they come up with? No. They're looking for the potential to weaken the Iranian state. That's it. Any negotiation, any deal has that purpose in mind, with the idea of going after them at a later date, just like they went after Syria for 10 years, if not longer. So I understand it's perfectly fine to engage in indirect talks. Even if you want to engage in direct talks, I agree with you. I don't see the great difference between indirect and direct. The only difference is that the Ayatollah said they will not be direct. And maybe they could be a fig leaf of, well, they're indirect in the moment, but they're direct later if they go well. Okay, right. I take issue with this position that we are focused on Iran. When, like you point out, Israel is on a genocidal rampage with a fascist state with nuclear weapons. I just find it outrageous that this is the conversation that we're effectively having with the US government that's threatening a country that is not threatening us. I find it to be amazing.
Mhm.
Do you think Trump is bluffing? That's the other thing that people are asking. Is this a bluff? Or is he really willing to take the world for Israel? Can you hear me? You still there?
I don't.
Oh, there.
Yeah, I'm there. So I absolutely do not think he's bluffing, and it would be very dangerous for people to make that assumption. Donald Trump, I just did a report on my program Reason to Resist. It was entirely focused on his first administration. And if you look at the first administration of Donald Trump, it has one big flashing word all over it in neon lights, and that word is war. That man is a warmonger. That man, he intensified the wars and prolonged the wars in Afghanistan, Syria. He, this is not the first time Trump has been torturing the Yemenis. He did that during his first administration. He,
Yeah.
did all sorts of things for Israel, which, they legitimized Israel's violations of international law, like the theft of the Syrian Golan Heights. But I think, and he also armed Ukraine, even though Obama wouldn't do that. He pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA. He pulled the U.S. out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The man was an absolute warmonger. But the thing that I think is most important, Jamarl, from his first administration was that he murdered Qasem Soleimani, the top Iranian general. And anybody who was thinking logically at that moment would have understood that by murdering that man, there was a high risk that you would end up provoking a full-blown war with Iran. And the only reason why it didn't happen is because the Iranians gave the Americans notice about what military bases they were going to hit, so that no American soldiers died when they retaliated. They showed restraint. That's why there wasn't a war. But if they had not shown restraint and they have inflicted casualties upon U.S. military personnel, as was their right, because there was an act of war made against them, what would have happened? There would have been a full-blown war. So it wasn't Donald Trump who stopped that from happening. It was the Iranians who stopped that from happening. He's perfectly capable of doing it, and I think he's serious. He's absolutely serious. And I personally believe that all this crap about, ending the war in Ukraine, what he really wants is he wants to suspend the fighting temporarily for two reasons. He wants to butter up the Russians so the Russians don't help the Iranians when they get attacked. They have a strategic partnership with Iran, which talks a lot about military cooperation. But most importantly, U.S. weapon stocks are very depleted, and the U.S. can ill afford to be providing weapons simultaneously to Ukraine, to Israel, and to its own forces to attack Yemenis and particularly Iran. And then that would leave them entirely naked, of course, in the Indo-Pacific region, where they're looking forward to making war against China one day. So I think that's all this is about. Hegseth gave a speech, in Brussels in early February, where he talked about a division of labor, and he said the Europeans, he basically ordered them, you arm Ukraine. The so-called peacemaker Trump, he sent his Secretary of Defense to tell the Europeans to drastically increase their military spending and arm Ukraine so that they could focus their military assets on China. That's all this is about. It's resource allocation. What he's doing in Ukraine, it's just pure resource allocation. It has nothing to do with a lasting peace. And this is all a lead up to the Iran war. I hope desperately that I'm wrong, Jamarl, but that's what I see is going on here. And I think it's pretty obvious.
That may be that's fair, right? That's a fair appraisal. If that is true, he's not going to get what he wants. Russia, look, I think the world is not as stupid as I think the United States thinks the world is. Russia is not going to give leeway in Iran and in the Ukraine. Meaning, from the Russian point of view, we're winning this war. You can't do anything about it. You've thrown everything at us. You've effectively fought this war, according to the New York Times. We are going to pursue our objectives until the special military operation is finished. And what that means is, from the Russian perspective, we want to deal with the root causes of this, period. That's the way they look at it. Anything short of that, it's not going to be accepted. And the U.S. can do nothing
I just want to say,
about it.
I'm sorry, I don't want to be misunderstood. I completely agree with you. I don't think this is going to work. I think it's going to fail miserably, and it's going to be ugly. But I'm just saying, I think that that's what's going on in Trump's head. Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm
No, you're fine. Interrupt me. I am a habitual interrupter. I don't think you're poorly, right? I guess my thing is Russia, China, Iran. There is a relationship there that I don't think that Russia and China is want to give up on. I agree with you that Russia's probably telling Iran, be pragmatic. Go ahead and talk to him. There's no harm in having a conversation. If it goes poorly, we're with you. But at least talk to him. Just like Putin, regardless of what happened. Putin knows that America has been directing this war, and yet he's Mr. Diplomatic. If you want to have a ceasefire, I'll talk to you about the ceasefire. Now, nobody believes that Russia is going to accept the ceasefire, right? But Putin's like, we'll talk to you about it. Let's have a conversation about it. Let's, we can talk over wine and cheese and sardines or whatever. Like, they are very diplomatic in the way that they effectively deal with Trump, even though they're still relentlessly, remorselessly accomplishing their objectives as they have this diplomatic track. So I would imagine they may be telling Iran the same thing. Look, we want to avoid a war. This guy's a lunatic. At the very least, talk to him, drag it out if that's what needs to be. So I firmly agree with you an entire way through. I guess my thing is, I don't know how they avoid a war either way, because I think you're right. I think all things being equal, what Trump wants is, I want your ballistic missiles. It's not about your nuclear program, because all things being equal, the JCPOA had a restraint on the nuclear program. We want your ballistics. And if you're willing to negotiate with us under threat, then we believe we may be able to get them. I think that's what this is headed, which Iran will say no, which the U.S. then reserves the right to attack. I think that's the bubble or the knot that we're stuck in with Trump. What do you think the consequences will be if he attacks Iran? Look, I think Ritter's position on this is ludicrous. The U.S. is going to go into unprovoked nuclear war, get all of Iran's retaliation capability, and destroy the entire state of 90 million people. I mean, even the framing of it is disgusting if you think about it. You're talking about killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in an unprovoked war. Astonishing. Just even making that point is pretty astonishing. But what do you think the actual consequences will be to the globe, to the region? I just find this to be utterly catastrophic.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's imagine a best case scenario. A best case scenario from the perspective of world peace and the survival of humanity, but obviously a very, very bad scenario for the Iranian people, is that Iran has to go it alone, and that Russia and China don't come to their assistance. And I'm going to come back to what I think, but let's suppose that so they're completely on their own. There's no question they've demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt when they struck the U.S. military base, for example, after the murder of Qasem Soleimani, and when they hit Israel twice last year, including its probably best protected military asset, the Nevatim Air Base, hit it over and over again. And we only know this because people filmed, something like 15 hypersonic missiles striking the base. They can penetrate the air defenses. It's just, there's no question that they can penetrate the best air defenses that the U.S. and Israel have to offer in West Asia. So they have a massive ballistic missile arsenal. They're going to cause a lot of damage, no doubt about it. They're going to kill Americans. They're going to kill Israelis. How many of these missiles they have and how many get through, I don't think anybody outside of Iran knows for sure, but they have enough to cause immense damage to Israel and to cause severe casualties to U.S. forces in the Middle East. I think the U.S. has something like 50,000 forces at least in West Asia. And, right across, if you look at Qatar, which has the largest U.S. military base in the region, it's literally like a few minutes flying time by hypersonic missile from Iran. They can obliterate that massive military facility very easily. So whether they can inflict comparable damage on, certainly they can inflict some damage on Iran, no doubt about it. But whether they can inflict comparable damage to what Iran can do really depends on the state of Iran's air defenses. I don't believe for 1 second that it's been demonstrated that the last Israeli attack is effectively wiped out or even seriously weakened Iran's air defenses. But even if that were true, they've had, I believe, 6 months now, 7 months to rebuild them with the assistance of the Russian Federation. And their strategic partnership agreement, as I mentioned, calls in many parts of it for military cooperation. So I think that they're going to be in a position to cause serious damage not only to the military bases and to Israel itself, but also to the Air Force of the United States and of Israel. They should be able to at least inflict some damage there. And the big one for the global economy, of course, is are they then going to expand the war to oil facilities in the region belonging to other countries, like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, like Qatar, Bahrain? If that happens, we could experience a global economic depression. If the price of oil soars enormously, and the supplies are choked off for a prolonged period of time. In the worst case scenario, Jamal, China and/or Russia, I don't think China or Russia are going to send their troops. That I don't think they're going to do. Maybe they'll send some naval vessels to try to deter, not to strike American vessels, but to deter attacks on the coastline or on other ports. I don't know, possibly. But I think what they're really more likely to do, in fact, I would be shocked if they don't do it, is provide technologies, weaponry, and military advice on the ground to the Iranians, who are already a formidable opponent. And if they do that, the question then becomes how is the United States going to respond? If the United States determines that the Chinese and or the Russians are helping the Iranians in ways that are causing casualties to Americans and Israelis, and preventing the U.S. from achieving its goals, how will they respond? And I don't know. It's an extraordinarily dangerous situation. There's no realistic scenario in a war with Iran that doesn't involve a catastrophic amount of suffering and great damage to the global economy, in my opinion. And it could actually spiral into a nuclear war.
Yeah, that's my concern too. Like these things are unpredictable. I mean, the First World War started, Archduke Ferdinand gets shot. And nobody was thinking that this was going to turn into a global war. It was a regional issue that just spiraled out of control at the moment that other governments gets involved with assurances saying, hey, I got your back. And in a similar way, it's like the U.S. telling Israel, hey, I got your back. Russia and China telling Iran, hey, I got your back. Okay, all of these are nuclear powers. How does that work, right? I mean, the only reason the Ukraine war didn't end up in a nuclear conflict is because Russia didn't acknowledge openly that the U.S. was on the ground effectively directing the events. But the moment that Russia would have said, hey, the U.S. is directly involved in killing 100,000 Russians, okay, you got to do with that. You got to do something with that, right? That's a political issue. The moment that you say it and state it out loud that that's effectively what's happening, the U.S. wouldn't have a leg to stand on, considering they've been killing 100,000 Russians. By the same token, it's not an issue of what's right and wrong. It's the issue of power. That seems to be the thing that carries the day. Now, I agree with you entirely on this. It is fascinating, thicket, that, again, another conflict that never needed to take place. Like, we had a deal. They were abiding by the deal. They abided by the deal for a year after Trump pulled out of the deal. So it's a bit rich that he's now coming back saying, if you don't have a deal, I'm going to attack you and destroy and kill a lot of people. It just really is. Dimitri, I'll give you the last word.
I'm going to say something that I've said so many times, starting to feel like a broken record, and that is, we in the West have the power to stop this madness. this criminality. We have to stop voting for the same goddamn parties over and over and over again. Americans had a choice in the last election. My person's had several choices who would have been far better than Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. And I'll mention two of them, Jill Stein and Cornel West. I think they would have made, even, without having any experience at that level of government, they certainly would have been a vastly preferable option. And same is true in Canada. You look at the polls, and Canadians are going to vote again for one of these two parties who've dominated politics in Canada for the entire post-World War II period. In Britain, they just put that clown Keir Starmer back. They took a man who stabbed Jeremy Corbyn in the back ruthlessly, and they gave him a majority government. And look what he's doing. He's not only fomenting more, he's also basically destroying the welfare state in Britain. So, my friends, we have to stop voting for these people. We have to have the courage of our convictions and start voting for people who have not betrayed us in the past, and give them a chance to govern. Only then can we fix these terrible wars.
By the way, do you think Europe is going to be stupid enough to pay the 5% that Marco Rubio is insisting they pay?
I'm sorry, I was distracted by somebody. There's a man out here. Yeah, Daxi. Sorry, could you ask me that question again tomorrow? I've been trying to tell this.
No, you're perfectly fine. Do you think Europe is going to end up paying that 5% increase in NATO membership that Marco Rubio is effectively trying to push them to pay?
If they could, they would. I think they're that crazy. I just don't think they can. They're gonna spend a lot of money. I think Trump understands that 5% is kind of like you bid high, and you'll get a better result. Even if your bid is unrealistic, you'll get a better result. This is classic, simple negotiating tactic. Will they end up somewhere around 3 to 4%, which would be potentially ruinous to Europe? Oh yeah, they're perfectly capable of doing that. I just don't think they can come up with that kind of money, 5% of GDP. And just to go back to my warning to voters out there, especially here in Europe, one day you're going to have to pay the piper. If they increase massively military spending with debt, they're going to come back in 5 years, 10 years, and tell you, what, we just have to say goodbye to our social programs, because otherwise we're going to go bankrupt.
Yep.
And it's the working class that's going to pay for this insanity.
So true. I think it's Estonia, where they couldn't pay teachers. I think they couldn't find like 80 million or 80 billion or whatever the number is for teachers. And then they found $100 million to send to Ukraine. 100 billion is like, oh, dude. Like, that is so outrageous. It's so, it's irresponsible as a state. And yet that's what they do. Dimitri, man, I always appreciate these conversations. Thank you for joining me. Dimitri Lascaris. He's a lawyer, journalist, activist from Montreal, Quebec. In 2020, Dimitri ran for leadership in the Canada Green Party of Canada. Dimitri, where can people find you, by the way?
On YouTube, my main gig is Reason to Resist. We put out 3 or 4 reports a week. We'll be doing a live stream today later on. And I'm very active on X, at Dimitri Lascaris. So you can also find me there.
What time is Reason to Resist? What time does it come on?
Well, our live stream today is going to be held at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time. But we do them kind of irregularly. Most of the time, we just publish pre-recorded reports about geopolitics.
Fair enough. My man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. You be safe.
You too. Take care, man.
All right.